spin on it. So if you're advocating for housing, for example, and changes, let's say, for example, changes in what we allow cities to do in terms of the landlord-tenant relationship, if you can tell a personal story that is going to, really bring that problem to light for me, that is going to have a lot more impact than if you come in with, a wad of papers full of statistics, et cetera. Those are good, those are important, they're useful. And so, you do want to include that, but it's that personal connection that's really going to make a difference. And I think I'll come back to examples of that as we're going through.
Jenny, you're on the other side of things.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, and it's an honor to be here with two of our incredible state legislators who work on so many of the issues that we at the Coalition of Communities of Color care about, and so many of you in this room as well. I think maybe literally even going back to Elizabeth's question about a golden rule when lobbying, I think it is key to consider that legislators, they are people too. They care, they're there for a reason, and it's because some issue, some desire, ideally at least some issue and some desire to represent their community members and make Oregon a better place is what brought them there. So it can feel kind of intimidating, especially if you are meeting in the Capitol. It's a very formal place. It can feel like it's not necessarily accessible, even if you have made that hour-long trip down I-5. But just to keep in mind that they are there to hear from you. And with that, then the other piece of the golden rule is always being nice, treating other people as you would want to be treated. And that goes to being polite with the legislator, to their staff, and then also thinking if you're working with other folks, if you have opposition on an issue that you care about, to remember everything that you say, you are telling a state legislator, and so to keep in mind to be polite and to be fair. Always to be honest. If you don't know the answer to a question, that's okay. And especially as a community advocate, you are not expected to be the ultimate expert with all answers right on hand. So if you are asked a question you don't know the answer to, then let the legislator know that you'll follow up and get back to them. And be sure that afterward that you do get back to them. Perhaps the last piece that can be easy, sometimes it's surprisingly easy to forget, is to make sure that you come in and that you make your ask clear, and that you have a hard ask at the end. When you tell them about what you want them to do, ask, can we count on your support for this piece of legislation?
That's great advice. And I want to ask you all for an example of really effective community advocacy. You touched on a couple different components of it. Either community advocacy or a constituent that passed a bill at the legislature that really stands out to you, that maybe used those great stories and made it all the way through the process. You want to start?
I'll start, sure. Let me tell you the story of, of a problem that first came to me within a constituent coffee that I had. One of the things I have done since I've been in the legislature for the last 10 years is every month, at least once a month, I'll have a constituent coffee. 20, 30 people will come together and talk about issues. I'll talk about the process. It becomes a kind of dialogue, and people will raise concerns and issues. And that is a great way, if you have a concern, to bring it to my attention, but not just to my attention, actually. It also is a way of getting other people to know about a particular issue. And so this is a story that actually goes back to, it was either 2014 or 2015. And we were starting to experience at that time, a lot of homes were being demolished and replaced with newer homes. So, small homes being demolished, replaced with large homes. And there was a lot of concern about what that was doing to the quality of life in neighborhoods. And there was a lot of, there was a lot of talk about that. But one element of it that was raised to me in a constituent coffee that I'd never thought about before was just the environmental impact, the public health impact of what happens when a house comes down in a demolition, that is, as opposed to a deconstruction, where it's taken apart piece by piece, but when it's demolished and the home includes toxic materials like asbestos or lead, what happens? It comes down and it sends dust into the neighborhood. And I had never thought about that. But it kind of, it resonated with me. And I offered to work on this problem with the group of people that were really concerned. And they were all people who were part of one of the neighborhood associations that, was part of my district. And I will say, just as an aside, Portland has a great system of neighborhood associations. I'm sure many of you are part of them, that can be also a vehicle for advocacy. So we started working on that and developed legislation that in the 2015 session, I worked with, so the representative for this part of the district is Alyssa Kenny-Geyer, who partnered with me on this. We actually share a lot of interest in public health and housing and those kinds of issues. And so we worked on a bill that would require that certain standards would be met for if a home were going to be demolished, to make sure that lead and asbestos were abated. So that bill passed. Ultimately, we brought stakeholders together, but it, for bureaucratic reasons, we weren't able to include lead in the first go-around. It was just asbestos, and it had to do with, just bureaucracy. So we had a choice, actually, of not passing the bill and waiting until those bureaucratic issues were resolved, which we were told would take a year or so. But we decided to go ahead and pass the bill with just it dealing with asbestos, and a promise that we would come back and deal with lead. And we did that in 2017. We came back with another bill that dealt with asbestos as well as lead. But also, in the meantime, we had discovered that our hopes for that bill, even just dealing with asbestos, was going to be a problem. And the cities needed to be given more authority to really set up, to create good ordinances that could deal with the problem. And that is just something also I want to throw out there for you to think about. And that is, Elizabeth did a great job of showing the process of a bill becoming a law. Of course, believe me, it's more complicated than that. And it's full of a lot more heartache and grief than she gave. But even when you are successful, then whatever the new statute has to be implemented by government agencies, either at the state level or local levels. And things can often develop new complications there. And so I want to tell you, you advocates, once the bill passes, don't just go and drink the champagne for the next 5 years. You also have to keep an eye on how this is being implemented. And that was the case here for this one. We realized that, we passed a great bill, it was limited, but even in that limited form, it really wasn't able to do what we wanted. So we had to go back and and as we were expanding it to include lead, we also needed to make some other changes. But fortunately, we did do that, and it passed. The city council passed an ordinance which created the program here in the city that regulates demolitions. And I was just talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago, and it seems to be working pretty well. So thank you. So yeah, so from, you know, a humble constituent coffee, you know, into something that really, you know, I believe is benefiting the public health of Oregonians in their neighborhoods.
Thank you. So we don't have time for the full grief and heartache version of the legislative 101. With a little bit of a time crunch, I want to ask 2 more questions before I turn it over to audience Q&A. And first is, Mr. Representative Jenny, what is the value of working in coalition as opposed to working independently?
So most of the work that comes from my office is actually through coalitions and partnerships with collective efforts that have already been organizing through grassroots organizing, whether that's through the Coalition of Communities of Color or the ACLU or CALSA Immigrant Rights Organization. But there are already collective groups of people who have been trying to address macro issues in our community for a while and have collectively come together to try to do something about it. So for example, some of the legislation that is coming from my office in the next session have to do with criminal justice, for example, and immigrant rights. Or some of it has to do with housing, some of it has to do, I would be very specific and talk about, I have a few TriMet bills. It's to deal with fair enforcement. And that's in partnership with the ACLU. So I am very strategic on making sure that my office works with the community and the community groups that are already organizing and saying these are issues that we want you to help push us. Making sure that it passes in the legislature. For example, I have a long history of being a student at the university. I went through undergrad and graduate, and so I was a part of the Oregon Student Association. So when I graduated with all this debt and learned how hard it was to go through higher education as a first-generation student, I really cared about student issues. And so I've been in relationship still with the Oregon Student Association and really care deeply about what the collective group of students, student governments care about and what they're advocating for. And so Senator Denbrough and I have worked together on tuition equity and other key legislation that Oregon Student Association has brought forward to us. And we are more of the facilitators and advocates pushing an agenda that's driven by a grassroots effort. And it's actually very strategic for us to work in partnership with these coalitions and community-based organizations and advocacy organizations because they already are there every day in Salem, and they have the lobby advocacy of talking to all other 89 members and educating them on what the issue is, what the solution is, and helping you do some of those tasks so that you're not the only one trying to pass this bill on your own, and you have a whole team on the ground making sure that it's, you know, not only are our legislators being educated, but also we're advocating it in the committee process and making sure that it's going to pass there, and making sure that it's aligned to what we're supposed to be in our planning process, strategic planning process of making sure that that bill is going to pass. And Coalition of Communities of Color does a lot of that, where they work with community-based organizations.
Yeah, so I think, so I represent actually a coalition of culturally specific organizations, and then we also work in coalition on other issue areas that we care about, so housing or criminal justice or immigrant rights, and so we partner with other organizations. And the reason that that's so important is because it is so much grief and heartache to get these bills passed. And, you need folks that come together and to make a really strong show to be persuasive, because you're not just convincing your own legislator, you're not just convincing the governor. These are legislative bodies, 60 representatives and 30 senators, and you have to get more, half of them plus one. So it's really critical that you're able to show a range of support, and then also to bring up different perspectives. So it can be very valuable to have people who represent different facets of the issue that you care about. So if you are working on housing, having someone who can bring a healthcare perspective, having someone who can bring a business perspective, an education perspective, that means a lot because it presents a compelling case, and you also don't always know what issue is going to reach someone really effectively. And the same goes for geography, because this is a state legislative issue, and then individual relationships. When you're in a coalition, then you have a better shot